we're starting to really count down the clock. They've got to get an OC hired. They got had a press conference today with Beth Getz, and she was asked about the process, and it is a Kirk Ferentz hire, but the administration is going to be involved with that. Of course, with any hire within the athletic department, the administration is going to have some involvement. And we continue to be told that we're very close to getting a name. My guess is that Kirk has had conversations over the last few days. If he hasn't, what are we doing? But I can tell you the one name that I tweeted out about earlier today was Brian Johnson. He just got let go from the Eagles, kind of a controversial move. I know a lot of people felt like it wasn't deserved. He puts together some really efficient offenses at Florida. He was also the OC at one time at Houston. Young guy. I know a lot of people, want youth. And so you might actually be able to tell us more about Brian Johnson, Mark, because he's, again, been at a few different places at the college ranks. But he is an NFL guy that recently left his position or is available on the market. And maybe another guy that Iowa should look at.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, because I don't want to confuse any people here, Brian Johnson, I'm almost certain, is the same Brian Johnson who was the quarterback for the Utah Utes when they pulled off a significant Sugar Bowl upset at the conclusion of the 2008 season. You were nodding in agreement. Therefore, yes, I've got the right Brian Johnson. So that's where I first know him from. Is yes, Utah was an undefeated football team in 2008. They defeated an undefeated Alabama team at the end of the season at the Sugar Bowl as a significant underdog. Now, in regards to his work at Florida in particular, outstanding. The passing attack, and you're putting in that situation two excellent offensive minds together with Dan Mullen as the head coach who coordinated the two national championship offenses at Florida under Urban Meyer. Then he's a head coach at Mississippi State, goes to Florida. Certainly thought a lot of Brian Johnson to bring him on board and let him orchestrate an offense that scored a zillion points and a zillion yards per game. Mostly, I don't want to say they didn't have a strong running game, because they did. They had a very balanced attack. But what was their calling card was Kyle Trask at quarterback, who almost mistakenly got the position through an injury to Felipe Franks and turned out to be the better player, and almost pulled off a monumental upset of an all-time great Alabama team, an undefeated team that won the national championship in the 2020 SEC championship game, and put up 46 points against a loaded Alabama defense. Was just a tremendous offensive machine. They put up 50. No, I'm mixing up teams. My bad. But anyway, the 46 spot against Alabama in the SEC championship game. Kyle Pitts at tight end. And I have not, I don't track the NFL like I once did. I just enjoy the games on Sunday afternoon, but I'm not the NFL expert of sorts that I would have been in years gone by. So I can't really speak to his work there, but
can I say something as it relates to the non-coaching situation? And this is not me forming an opinion about hiring criteria. But Mark, if it works out this way, 3 or 4 years ago, Iowa had a scandal that led to the firing of Chris Doyle, and there were some other people that were involved with some controversy regarding that issue, including Brian Ferentz, who just lost the job as OC. What was that issue surrounding, Mark?
Well, it was surrounding race.
So surrounding race, and I want to make very clear, the firing of Kelton Copeland here recently had nothing to do with race. Okay. That wide receiver position has been a struggle, and the offensive line job has been a struggle. Although George Barnett has not yet lost his job, that's not because his skin is white. But let me just say this, hiring a black OC may not be the worst thing from a public eye standpoint. Again, should not matter, right? Skin color should not matter. Race should not matter. From a PR standpoint, though, you don't want, I don't know how it looks firing a black position coach, bringing in two white position coaches in. Again, should not matter, but in the world we live in, you wonder. But with all race aside, Brian Johnson, really impressive resume. I did see someone on Twitter that responded to my initial thing about Brian Johnson, and he said, this is the Chad Smith on Twitter. He says, lifelong Eagle fan here. No, he loves an ineffective screen pass more than Kirk and Brian combined. Literally, more of the same. I'd be very sad if this happened. Now, listen, I am not an Eagles fan either. In fact, I reached out to a good friend of mine, Gary Close, who's our coach for our men's basketball shows, who's currently recovering from an illness. But I've yet to hear back from Gary. He is also a huge Eagles fan, and he's from Philly. So I'll be anxious to get his opinion on Brian Johnson. But the numbers, the resume, regardless of, this comment, the resume indicates that he is an offensive mind. He's a former quarterback. He obviously understands the passing game. So to say more of the same, even without having watched the Eagles offenses of late, I cannot imagine that that's an even remotely accurate statement to make.
They scored 35 points in the Super Bowl last year.
I understand when you're real close to a situation, like obviously there's a reason they fired him, right?
Yep.
They're coming off a Super Bowl defeat. They kind of flamed out this year. I get it. So, but there's controversy around that move, and I don't want to say beggars can't be choosers, but Iowa's had the worst offense in the nation, and one of the biggest issues with this offense is their lack of downfield attack. And you brought up the Kyle Trask era, but what Brian Johnson gave to Utah as a player, he's obviously someone who could help them stretch the ball down the field, I would think.
So I'll speak to two things. Continuing on the Iowa portion of this and the fit, it doesn't seem like a fit on the surface because of the pass heavy and the up tempo, spread them out, create matchups in the open space type of approach at Florida versus what Iowa likes to do. And also just not speaking to his situation in particular at Philadelphia, because again, I'm not tracking the NFL like I once did. So I have no opinion about his performance, except for they were obviously highly successful. This has been one of the top 2 or 3 franchises in the NFL in the past few years, and scored a lot of points, high scoring Super Bowl performance last year, had a very successful year that, as you stated, flamed out. Don't know exactly what their record was, but it was one of the better records in the league up until the last 4 or 5 games. Then they take a downturn, and and who knows what the relationships are and what else is going on there, what other dynamics. But this seems to happen way too often in sports where somebody's a proven commodity. There's like a 4 or 5 game stretch that doesn't go well. Suddenly you're going to fire them.
John Maybanks in the chat says, Eagles fan here. Their offense slid into a very Brian Ferentz-like mess this year. Empty sets on 3rd and short, slow developing pass plays. Play calling was, quote, very bad. I mean, if you're an Eagles fan, you'd know better than I would. I'm just going by track record, history, resume. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's factual.
I just think there's way too much. And I am not in any way disparaging what Chad has to say. He's watching all the games apparently and really invested in Philadelphia Eagles football. I am not. Again, I know who the players are on the field, and that's about it. And who knows how much I saw the Eagles this year. I can't recall. So I don't know anything close to that. But I generally don't think that coaches are excellent at what they do one season and then suddenly don't know what they're doing the next year.
Yeah, I agree. And let me just say this. Regardless of the opinion of someone like Brian Johnson, I watched less NFL football this year than probably ever in my life, which is insane. And you know how I guess you get busy on the weekends, etc. But let me say this. He will get hired by somebody. He has got too good of a resume to not get hired by somebody. And I'll give you another example of somebody who will be hired by somebody. Frank Reich will be hired by somebody. I brought his name up weeks ago. He'll likely end up as an OC somewhere else. So why would you not, if he's considered to be maybe one of the 30 to 40 best offensive football minds currently in football in the sport, why would you not consider him for the open position at Iowa? Now, I want to address a name that was tossed out there earlier this week. And this is not me reporting anything. I've not had conversations with Kirk Ferentz. Like I've said in the past, this information was kept very close to the vest. But I was told about a month ago, maybe a little less than a month ago, that there was a big name candidate that had reached out to Kirk Ferentz. I made that statement on this very show. All right. And that was on really good authority. Excellent source that I trust gave me that information. But I was never told who that individual was. Okay. And it sounded like that was due to the wishes of Kirk Ferentz and this potential candidate, that they did not want this out in the open. This week, there have been some rumors circulating. And I'll say this, I have reason to believe this rumor is true. And that is that big name candidate very well may have been Chip Kelly. And I know that's going to surprise people, but the indicators that I'd been given, and I had a conversation with someone else who covers the sport, covers Iowa here a little bit earlier in the afternoon, and he kind of provided some more clarity as to the situation with Chip Kelly's contract. I was not aware of this, but it sounds like Chip Kelly did reach out to Iowa about the offensive coordinator job. Chip Kelly has a multi-million-dollar buyout at UCLA. So if he were to leave the Bruins, I'm assuming that Iowa would have to fork over the money. That's a lot of money to buy out a coordinator at a different job, a guy who's actually the current head coach at UCLA. The other thing that's been brought up with as it relates to Chip Kelly is, why would he leave a head coaching job at UCLA to come be the coordinator at Iowa? Chip Kelly has been very outspoken about NIL and just the changing landscape. And being a head coach is different than being a coordinator. I know there have been reports this week, again, cannot substantiate it. I'm not in the NFL business, but there have been reports this week that NFL teams have been reaching out to Chip Kelly and are interested in vetting Chip Kelly to be their next OC. So I'm just telling you, this is not information that I've gotten from Chip Kelly or Kirk Ferentz, so it is secondhand. I want to make very clear, this is not information that I scurried over to my VIP, my premium board, like some people do, to relate, shed this information down to my premium subscribers. But I've been given reason to believe that Chip Kelly was a name that was legitimately in the mix at one point, but it sounds like that's not happening. Iowa's not going to be pursuing that, whether that be more so because Chip Kelly chose not to pursue Iowa or because of the buyout, or maybe it's the philosophy difference between Chip Kelly and Kirk Ferentz. But what an intriguing name if true. What an intriguing name if true. And again, it fits. The other thing is it fits the confines of what I'd been told a month ago from this very trustworthy source that gave me an indicator that a big name that you would, this is what I was told at the time, a big name that you would never guess reached out to Iowa. Well, Chip Kelly's a big name that I would have never guessed and reached out to Iowa. So anyways, that's my hypothesis, if you will. Again, I would not repeat it unless I had decent reason to believe it. But I don't think it's going to matter because he is not in the conversation right now, and I don't know who is, frankly.
All right. Let me dive into this a little bit with Chip Kelly. And by the way, Brian Johnson led the 6th best rushing attack in the NFL and the 9th best passing attack in the NFL this 2022 season when they went to the Super Bowl. And I'm sure the numbers went down a little bit this past season, but they were still a successful team. Chip Kelly to Iowa as offensive coordinator. So the reason that makes no sense is all the obvious things that Chip Kelly's a highly successful coach. As a head coach, he's had 2 major jobs at the collegiate level, 2 NFL jobs. Why would somebody then draw their career back to be an offensive coordinator, especially since he's coming off fairly successful seasons at UCLA? They didn't fire him. It was talked about late in the season that he could be let go there. They won their bowl game to finish 7-5. They beat their rival USC in a big way. So they finished fairly strong. They did lose their last regular season game. Again, an 8-5 season coming off his most successful year, 9-4, the year before, in which they were like this close to being much better than that win-loss record. They were like that close to going to the Pac-12 championship game, like 15 yards away from getting in field goal range to go to the Pac-12 championship game. And the year before that, they were 8-4. So he's on a decent run. And again, this guy's taken a team to a national championship game. He's coached 2 NFL teams. On the flip side of that, it's well been known that Chip Kelly does not like to recruit. Even in the old world, didn't like to recruit, doesn't like to mess with it. He just wants to coach. So maybe with NIL and the transfer portal, he has just really grown tired of it and just wants to. And with salaries escalating the way they are, you can be, we see Iowa's most recent moves on the defensive side of the ball. And from a salary standpoint, and that you can be a coordinator at a top flight program and make a nice little living. And maybe just Chip Kelly has arrived at the place in his career where he's okay with that. He does have a strong personality. And after you've been in charge for so long and been the guy, I would think it would be difficult to step back. And again, and this is reputation speaking here. This is not me knowing Chip Kelly, but I do know people that have had to deal with him in the media on a consistent basis and speak with him on a regular basis. They say he's a difficult sort to deal with. He's moody.
So
he's
is Brian.
A bit abrasive and those
so
things.
is Brian, for the record.
So my take on Chip Kelly.
No, that's good stuff. And like I say, I've been given no indication that door is opening back up, but it sounds like there was at least some interest on at least one side of the table there. So that's an intriguing thing. On3, I think it was On3 reported towards the end of the season that he was likely to lose his job, and he didn't. So, when I was talking to this other individual that covers Iowa athletics, he just said to me, hey, he's probably going to get fired next year unless they have a really good year. And it's going to be hard to have a really good year heading into this conference, clearly. So, maybe he is thinking proactively, but I don't know. I guess we don't need to spend time talking about it. I thought about not even repeating it here, but I'd kind of been teasing that for a while. I didn't know who it was until recently and was given pretty strong indication that it was indeed Chip Kelly. So whatever. I'm sure there have been other people that have reached out. As far as people that I think are still available, talk about NFL guys. Brian Johnson's one, Frank Reich's one, Pete Carmichael's one. Somebody in the live chat said David Rye. I would quit my show if David Rye was hired as the OC. No offense to David Rye. David Rye doesn't have any resume to be the next offensive coordinator at Iowa. What has David Rye done? Almost called you Don. What has he done, Mark?
Well, nothing, again, to warrant that hire.
So just so people are aware, right now he is with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a senior offensive analyst. Okay. And let me run up his bio here. So, of course, he played quarterback at Iowa, never really played, right? So he was a backup reserve at Iowa. He was a GA at Iowa from 2010 to 2012. He then coached. I was an assistant quarterbacks coach at Texas Tech for the Red Raiders in 2013. He was a coaching administrator for the Packers from 2014 to 2015. Then he coached O-line, and he coached whatever offensive perimeter means. I didn't know there was such a position. Coached offensive perimeter at Green Bay. Coached wide receivers in 2018. Coached receivers for the Cardinals from 2019 to 2020. Then was at Vanderbilt in 2021 and was the OC. And my understanding is that midway through the season, lost his play calling duties and resigned at the end of the year after 1 year with Vanderbilt. Now, why on earth should Iowa be even looking at him? Like, if you want to talk about the quarterback coaching position when it was open 2 years ago, that was the name that was thrown out there. And even with that, I was like, I think I can do better. Heaven forbid. If they bring in David Rye, might as well just promote John Budmeyer. John Budmeyer's got a better resume than David Rye. And I don't want John Budmeyer either. No offense to either of those guys. They may be super guys, but I don't want either of them to be the next offensive coordinator. And with what Iowa's done with salaries here over the last couple of weeks, you got Seth Wallace making $1 million. You've got Phil Parker making $1.9 million. They have enough money. They're setting this up to have enough money to be able to pay a lump sum to whoever that next offensive coordinator is. Can you imagine bringing in David Ryan saying, "We got $1.5 million for you, David"? Like, come on. What do you think he's making as an analyst down at Tampa Bay? Could you imagine?
I've heard the college analyst position is low paying. So you're either up and coming guy hoping to break through, or you're James Laurinaitis, Ohio State, made a ton of money in the NFL, doesn't have a worry in the world financially, knew that it was just going to be kind of like a 1-year stop as an analyst. Now he's linebackers coach at Ohio State. So, and just the typical approach, the conventional approach to replacing someone in sports would be that, let's say, once Phil Parker moves on, okay, this guy is the best in the business, certainly one of the 2 or 3 best, arguably the best. Let's hire someone who is going to hopefully be able to keep the train rolling, similar style, so forth and so on. But if you're unsuccessful, whether that's in the head coaching position or in this case on the offensive side of the ball, well, we tried it with someone who had no play calling experience, who had no pass game experience and all these. Well, let's go. That didn't work. Let's go for a guy that is accomplished in those areas. And by the way, Brian Johnson, I also went to this season. So the Super Bowl season, the numbers were top 5 to 10 in the league in both rushing and passing. This season, despite the record drop, I was expecting to see a drop in offensive production. Nope. They were almost exactly the same. Top 4, 5, 6 in both rushing and passing this season, the Eagles. And stats can be skewed to a certain extent, but that's over a 17-game NFL season.
Now, let's make something very clear. One of the best quarterbacks in the world plays for Philly in Jalen Hurts. Okay. They also have a really underrated tight end in Dallas Goedert. They have a really good pair of receivers, one being A.J. Brown, the other being what's-his-face from Bama, right?
Devontae Smith, sure.
Devontae Smith, who's gotten better as his career has gone on. But all those stats are extremely valid. And, as it relates to the position as it currently stands, you brought up, well, it didn't work under Brian Ferentz and hiring a guy who didn't have play calling experience. I think the fear that is at least is in the back of my mind, my head, and I'm not saying that this overwhelms me, because I still think it's going to be almost impossible not to have a significant upgrade as it relates to the resume of whoever gets hired. But what I fear, Mark, is what you said is not necessarily believed by Kirk Ferentz. Have we ever heard Kirk Ferentz say that somehow this last era was a failure, was an offensive failure? Like, you talk about how it didn't work. I don't know that Kirk Ferentz, does he believe that it didn't work? That's the problem. Like, he's not the one who made, like, we're all happy Beth Getz was pressured by Barbara Wilson and the powers that be to make this decision and, relieve Brian Ferentz of his duties. But that doesn't mean that Kirk ever bought into the decision. I guarantee you he did not. So has he been able to look at this situation and say, well, we got to go a different direction because it really didn't work out with my son? I don't know that that's the case. But again, I think it's hard to defend. Like, he hired Brian, promoted Brian, etc. And I know people use that word nepotism a lot. If it had been anybody else that was on the staff, coaching running backs or tight ends, whatever Brian was coaching at the time, O-line, he would not have been promoted to OC like he was. It just wouldn't have happened. So that is nepotism at its finest. Okay. So I guess my point is I don't expect Kirk to hire somebody else with the resume of a Brian Ferentz, because unless it's Steve Ferentz or James Ferentz, uh, it's likely not going to be a family member. It's not going to be a family member. So I would like to think that, knowing he's not going to hire somebody in his family, it's got to be somebody with a good resume. And hopefully he looks at the situation not as, well, we got to go somewhere different because this last era was a failure, but what's the best hiring criteria for an offensive coordinator? And I would think some of the things that you've talked about, that I've talked about, would have to be on the list, right? What is a guy's play calling background? I mean, Joe Philbin was a guy that his name was tossed out there, but I have questions about Joe Philbin's play calling experience. He's an older coach, but he's not known to be a play caller. Mike McCarthy was calling plays at Green Bay when Joe Philbin was there. Now, he probably knows a lot about offense, but again, are you going to settle for someone with minimal experience play calling? So I'd be curious to sit down with Kirk and ask him. Of course, it's never going to happen, but I'd love to ask him, Kirk, what is your criteria here? What are your points of criteria? And see what he lists first, second, third. Like, is it a coordinator who is known for just limiting turnovers? Is that priority number one? Or is priority number one a guy who is run first no matter what? Like, we just don't know exactly. We know Kirk wants things to work within his stratosphere, and that can be successful, but we just don't know what order of operations as it relates to hiring criteria.
I wonder if it ever runs through his mind, even if he has to suppress the thought and not let it enter Kirk Ferentz's mind, that, you know what? What if we blew up this offense? What if we went a totally different direction and hired somebody who would innovate and really push the throttle and do some different things? We have the defense that could support that in a different way and not have this complementary football style. But, look at what Wisconsin did last year. And did it work? No. Was it an utter disaster? No. They were much more proficient on offense than Iowa. They just went 7-5 instead of 10-2 because they didn't have the defense that Iowa had.
Also had a harder schedule.
Yeah, they ran into Ohio State and so forth. Yes. I just wonder if that ever enters his mind to say.
I'm sure it has. Absolutely. I mean, if Chip Kelly's calling Kirk Ferentz, I guarantee you Kirk's response was not, "Oh, hi, Chip." No way. Beep. Like, that's not happening. Obviously, I'm sure Kirk is not dumb. He's a very smart person. So,
sure.
I mean, I was told at the time that whoever that mystery candidate was, that was a consideration. But, how adaptable does that candidate need to be to Kirk's frame of mind? Or how adaptable is Kirk willing to be with that candidate's frame of mind?
In this more competitive conference, instead of having the approach that we're going to continue to do what we do and try to bleed dry an 8-4 record and be competitive, we're going to field the same defense at the same caliber that we have for the last 5 or 10 years. And we're going to marry that with an offense that's going to scare people. And hey, maybe we'll surprise people.
Wouldn't that be great, Mark? Wouldn't that be something? Oh, man, I don't know. I really don't know. And I've gotten no intel on who potential candidates are in the last week. I'm sure Kirk's got to have somebody in mind right now. I just can't imagine that here we're sitting the 23rd day of January and he still has no idea who the coordinator is going to be. I just can't imagine that. But I have not heard anything substantial. And honestly, I'm not combing to try to find out who he's talking with. We've had so much talk and different names of candidates, and everything's fallen through up until this point. And we're going to know. I would think we have to know in the next week or two max. Again, if we hit February 1st and we still don't have any leads here, I think if we hit February and we don't have an official announcement, there's a reason for serious concern because you're starting to get up to fall or to spring practice. Jason listed 2 names, and the one name I had heard, Kevin Johns, had been tossed out there. I had not heard anything about Luke Getsy. Again, these are these from? Is this from a credible source, or it's not coming from me? But Jason says Kevin Johns, Luke Getsy are the 2 most recent names that have been tossed out there. Luke Getsy, so he was recently fired by the Bears, correct?
I don't know who that is. Luke Getsy.
So yeah. I was thinking he was the OC for the Bears. Was he fired last year, I think? That Bears offense has been a disaster for so long.
Yeah.
So like that doesn't, not to say he wouldn't be an upgrade, but that, and then Kevin Johns is at Duke, right? Or was at Duke? Is he still?
Yeah.
Is he still there?
So just to clarify, on Getsy, 2 years as Bears offensive coordinator, 22 and 23. Before that, quarterbacks coach and passing game coordinator with the Packers going back to 2019. Did work in the college game at Mississippi State, 2018. So that would have been under Joe Moorhead, a team that played Iowa in a bowl game that Iowa won, close ball game. Johns, now that Manny Diaz, of course, with the coaching change, Mike Elko goes from Duke to Texas A&M. Manny Diaz comes in as head coach at Duke from his Penn State defensive coordinator spot. I don't know if he was retained or where that stands right now.
Okay, let me real quickly grab John's you probably got his resume up there.
Yes.
But I'm going to pull it up as well because where was he at before Duke?
He was at Memphis for 3 seasons, offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach. So they were successful during those years. Those were Ryan Silverfield years. He was at Indiana, offensive coordinator for 6 seasons. So that was like the Kevin Wilson run. When Indiana had some really good offenses during that time.
Those weren't
good teams. No.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is, I have not done my due diligence on Kevin Johns, but I'd be more intrigued to look at what his offensive tenure was like at Memphis, because that was an extended stretch where he was coaching quarterbacks. He also has a year under his belt coaching receivers at Texas Tech. He coached receivers at Northwestern, actually, as well.
I guarantee that the numbers are good at Memphis.
Yeah. Well, Memphis tends to have a good offense. In general, they do pretty well recruiting players down there and good skill position players. So anyways, yeah, I mean, maybe.
And his last season at Memphis, he would have been the offensive coordinator for Mike Norvell in his last season at Memphis.
Okay. Yeah, and then as far as Luke Getsy, you don't know much about Luke Getsy other than what I said. I just remembered last I knew he was, he'd gotten fired by the Bears, right? Pull up here, hired by the Bears in January of 2022. He just fired January 10th. But man, that Bears offense has not been good, has it? I'm not a Bears fan, but I know a lot of people in the area are, and I just don't hear anything good about the Bears. So,
well, he coached Justin Fields the last 2 years, and Justin Fields was the first quarterback, I think the second quarterback in history to rush for 1,000 yards. I'm sure that's exactly what Kirk wants out of his quarterback, run for 1,000 yards.
Yeah. T. Hink must have gotten in here late. He says, any smoke about Chip Kelly, or have they talked about that rumor?
Watch the rest of the show. Yes.
We talked about it earlier. Just rewind, T. Hink. We did talk about it.